If you value careful, evidence-based history that looks beyond battles and generals, subscribe to the Survival Record. This channel exists to document how ordinary people endured extraordinary pressure and, well, why those details still matter. Most people think of survival in the Second World War as something that happened at the front, soldiers improvising under fire, units adapting or collapsing. What's less understood is that for millions of families, survival was not a moment of heroism, but a continuous logistical problem. The war turned homes into frontline spaces. Scarcity, occupation, displacement, and state control meant that staying alive depended less on courage than on preparation, adaptability, and a small number of tools that quietly became lifelines. These were not luxury items or clever gadgets. They were ordinary objects, repurposed by necessity, and they shaped how civilians endured the longest total war in modern history. What follows is not a catalogue of gear, but an examination of 7 survival tools that repeatedly appear in diaries, ration records, resistance accounts, and post-war studies. They mattered not because they were rare, but because they allowed families to retain agency when institutions failed. By 1941, in much of Europe and Asia, currency had lost its practical meaning. Inflation, occupation authorities, and centralized distribution made cash unreliable. Ration cards replaced money as the true measure of survival. They determined not only how much food a family could obtain, but whether they could obtain any at all. Ration systems varied widely, but the underlying reality was the same. Calories became state-controlled. Families learned quickly that protecting ration cards was as important as protecting identity papers. Lost cards could mean weeks without bread or fats, and replacement was often impossible under occupation regimes. This changed household behavior. Meals were planned around ration cycles rather than hunger. Children were taught to understand scarcity early. Black markets emerged not as moral failures, but as adaptive systems when official rations dropped below subsistence levels. After the war, military planners and civil defense agencies studied these systems closely, recognizing that civilian resilience depended on predictable access to food, not simply total supply. Fuel shortages were universal. Coal, wood, and gas were diverted to industry and the military, leaving families to cook with whatever they could scavenge. The pressure cooker became an uncelebrated but transformative tool. By reducing cooking time dramatically, pressure cookers allowed families to prepare legumes, grains, and tougher cuts of food using minimal fuel. In occupied France, the Netherlands, and parts of Germany, pressure cookers were explicitly recommended in civilian survival pamphlets. In Japan, similar sealed cooking vessels became common as charcoal and gas disappeared. This tool altered nutrition outcomes. Foods that would otherwise be impractical to cook became staples. It also influenced post-war design of emergency kitchens and disaster relief protocols, where fuel efficiency remains a primary concern. Survival was not only about what food was available, but whether families could afford to cook it. One of the most consistent features of civilian survival under occupation was concealment. Families across Europe constructed false walls, buried containers in gardens, and modified furniture to hide food, tools, documents, and radios. These storage solutions were not primarily about hoarding. They were about maintaining flexibility. Hidden flour or dried vegetables allowed families to survive ration inspections. Concealed radios provided access to uncensored information. In Eastern Europe, hidden compartments often stored seeds for post-war planting, reflecting long-term thinking even amid collapse. Post-war intelligence agencies took note of how concealment techniques supported resistance networks. The lesson was simple but profound. Survival improves when individuals can control when and how resources are revealed. Modern survival doctrine still emphasizes redundancy and concealment as core principles. When factories shut down or were repurposed, households reverted to pre-industrial problem-solving. Simple hand tools, saws, planes, sewing kits, shoe repair tools, became essential. Shoes were repaired repeatedly rather than replaced. Clothing was resized, repurposed, and patched until fabric disintegrated. Furniture was dismantled for firewood. In rural areas, hand tools allowed families to cultivate marginal land and maintain equipment without access to spare parts. This widespread reliance on manual tools influenced post-war reconstruction strategies. Planners realized that resilience depended on decentralized skills, not just centralized production. It also reinforced a lesson that survivalists still emphasize. Tools matter most when they extend human capability without relying on external systems. Bombing campaigns and, neglected maintenance made clean water unreliable. In besieged cities like Leningrad, and later in war-damaged German and Japanese cities, waterborne disease became a really serious threat. Boiling was the primary method of purification, but honestly, fuel scarcity made this difficult. Families improvised filters using sand, charcoal, and cloth. In some regions, ceramic filters were distributed or, traded. Wells were carefully protected and sometimes even guarded communally. These experiences directly shaped post-war public health policy. Military and civilian authorities recognized that water access was not merely an engineering problem, but actually a security issue. Modern emergency water filtration systems owe much to lessons learned by civilians forced to improvise under fire. When fuel was rationed or just unavailable, bicycles replaced motorized transport almost overnight. They allowed families to reach farms, black markets, workplaces, and relatives. They were silent, repairable, and independent of centralized supply chains. In occupied territories, bicycles also allowed discreet movement that avoided checkpoints and scrutiny. Couriers, resistance members, and ordinary civilians relied on them to maintain social and economic networks. After the war, military logisticians studied bicycle mobility in urban and semi-rural environments. While often dismissed as primitive, the bicycle proved that low-tech solutions could outperform complex systems under resource constraints. Perhaps the least tangible but most important survival tool was information. Families preserved agricultural manuals, medical guides, repair handbooks, and handwritten notes. Knowledge was shared orally, taught to children, and guarded carefully. Knowing how to grow food, treat minor injuries, preserve harvests, or repair tools meant fewer dependencies on failing institutions. In ghettos and camps, clandestine education persisted even under extreme repression, reflecting an understanding that survival extended beyond the present moment. This emphasis on knowledge influenced post-war civil defense planning, which increasingly focused on public education rather than solely infrastructure. The lesson remains relevant. Tools fail, but understanding how to adapt endures. The families who survived the Second World War did not do so because they were stronger or luckier than others. They survived because they recognized early that systems were fragile, and they adapted accordingly. Their tools were not symbols of ingenuity so much as evidence of realism. They understood that endurance depends on preparation, flexibility, and the ability to function when guarantees disappear. Remembering these lesser-known stories matters because they reveal the civilian dimension of total war, how survival is negotiated quietly, day by day, long after headlines fade. If this kind of grounded, in-depth analysis is valuable to you, subscribe to the Survival Record and share this video with others who care about understanding history beyond the surface.